All right, so then I can see that the clock has reached 2 o'clock, and then it's my great pleasure to wish good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the INTERSECT webinar series. The INTERSECT project is a project hosted at MF and co-organized with CREX, the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. The aim of the project is to analyze Islamophobia as a global phenomenon, and you are welcome to visit our website intersectingflows.com if you are curious to learn more about our research. The next webinar will take place on the 29th of October, when Professor Göran Larsson at University of Gothenburg will give a talk titled "Telling the Truth About Islam, Ex-Muslims and Anti-Muslim Narratives." Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce INTERSECT colleague Sindre Bangstad, who is research professor at KIFO, that is the Institute for Church, Religion and Worldview Research. The title of the talk is "Burning the Quran, Blasphemy, Free Speech and Hate Speech in Norway." Sindre will speak for 30 minutes and then we will have an open Q&A session. Please send us your questions in the question section at Zoom. We have locked the chat function. Sindre's talk, but not the Q&A session, will be recorded, and for that reason we do not do video participation for the attendees. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Sindre on this very timely and important topic.
So thank you very much for that generous introduction. I would like to welcome you all to this INTERSECT lecture. It's a great honor to be presenting. Though Professor Frydenlund didn't mention it, the INTERSECT project is in fact the first time ever that the Norwegian Research Council has funded any project on Islamophobia. And so for those of us who have been working in this field for a number of years, it is actually something of an achievement that we've managed to set this entire project afloat. Now, a little bit about myself. I'm a social anthropologist, right? With a background from empirical research on Muslims in Cape Town, South Africa, and in Oslo, Norway. As an anthropologist, my interest is not in this perennially contested question concerning what Islam is or isn't. Now, Muslims have their interpretations of what Islam is and isn't, and can be and cannot be. And we certainly see in the context of the past 3 decades in Western Europe and across the Western world that there's a great deal of very opinionated views on what Islam is and isn't, and what Muslims may be or may not be, coming from people who have no background in any empirical research on Muslims, and certainly to a great extent have limited, experience living with or among Muslims, right? So this is my starting point. And this has to be said. So, as an anthropologist, Islam is what individual Muslims make of it. It is a question of how they interpret their religious tradition, right? My title today is "Burning the Quran, Blasphemy, Free Speech and Hate Speech." And as most of you will be perfectly well aware of, this has in contemporary Norway, at least in the past year or so, been a topic that has occupied quite a great deal of media attention and general attention in the public sphere. So I will start with the following. Let me see. Here we have a problem already. There. So I start with the following quote. This comes from the quite well-known feminist scholar Judith Butler, who in response to an intervention by Salah al-Assad and the late Sabah Mahmoud, who was a student of Salah al-Assad, but unfortunately died from cancer at a very early age some years ago. Butler poses the crucial question here: under what conditions does freedom of speech become freedom to hate? I also want to highlight here a quote by the media studies scholar Gavin Titley, who has written a very interesting recent book, which was published earlier this year by Policy Press in the UK in its so-called Debating Race series. The title of the book is Free Speech Racist? And one of the key ideas in Titley's work here is that we have, over the past few decades, and especially since the cartoon crisis of 2005, 2006, seen what he refers to as a far-right capture of free speech. So I'm going to read out the following quote. Titley writes on pages 103 and 4 in his book that while the civilizational horizon of anti-Muslim racism provides free speech, fostering with a particular heroic balance, far-right capture precedes this concentrated animus and extends beyond it. To rally under the banner of free speech is to invite others beyond the particular details of the day to recognize the principle at stake and to either support what is right or contribute to the further erosion of rights. In other words, you're either for or against free speech, and this is in the sort of far-right capture of free speech posited as a question of a zero-sum game in which, you know, you either win or you lose, and to be on the right side is to endorse absolutist conceptions of free speech. The capture of free speech aims to create space for racist speech as a beleaguered expression of liberty and positions the dissemination of racist discourse as a contribution to democratic vitality. In other words, and this we quite easily see in the rhetoric of SIAN or Stop The Islamisation of Norway. They definitely regard themselves as a beleaguered minority fighting, so to speak, in the trenches to preserve the last remnants of Western liberal free speech traditions, right? So one might think that this is, you know, it's ludicrous posturing, but there's no doubt that they really believe this, right? And they also express the view that unless you're prepared to accept all kinds of uses of free speech, including the use of free speech in order to further racist and hate speech, you're not sufficiently committed to democratic vitality, right? You're a defeatist and on the side of those who wants to more or less, you know, defeat the central tenets of Western liberalism. So in my case, on November 16, 2019, members of the far-right and racist organization SIAN or Stop The Islamisation of Norway burned the Quran in public during a SIAN demonstration in the southern Norwegian city of Kristiansand for the first time. Three counter-demonstrators of Muslim backgrounds trespassed the police cordon between the anti-racist counter-demonstration, which was, of course, as we've seen repeatedly in the Norwegian context, much more numerous than the SIAN demonstration itself, and attacked SIAN's chairperson, Mr. Lars Thorsen, physically. Now, whilst the counter-demonstrators were put to the ground by police officers and later fined by police, Thorsen was evacuated by police officers due to police concerns relating to his safety. As a matter of fact, Thorsen was stuck in a prison cell at the headquarters of the police in Kristiansand for several hours because the police was scared to let him out, basically. And if we look at the details, it's clear that before this happened, Kristiansand police had several meetings with the municipality, with Thorsen and SIAN, in which the head of police and those in charge at the Kristiansand police headquarters had made it clear that they wouldn't allow open fire during this demonstration. In other words, they made it clear to Thorsen and SIAN that they were actively going to prevent him from setting fire to the Quran. Now, basically, Thorsen ignored those orders from the police when he tried to set fire to the Quran. Other members of SIAN, such as Arne Thurmyr, threw in a similar act of desecration of the Quran, threw copies of the Quran into garbage bins at the venue of this demonstration. So I'm not doing trigger warnings. This is what it looked like. And in the background here, you can see the Dome Church in Kristiansand. So this is a very central town square in Norway's fourth largest city, a city which has, over the past few decades, also had a significant population of Muslim background. And if you pay attention to Mr. Thorsen's dress, this is a sort of quasi-military outfit, right? So the cap here is a Norwegian Home Guard cap. Now, if you spoke to a military officer in Norway, he would probably say that I don't particularly like this use of Norwegian military uniforms, right? For the purpose of presenting, quite far-right political views, right? But this is a cap that you could get from any military bargain sale in Norway. So it's, strictly speaking, not illegal. It would be illegal if Mr. Thorsen was a serving military officer in the Home Guard or any other army unit in Norway. Since then, counter-demonstrations against SIAN have increasingly involved violence against police forces protecting SIAN demonstrations and against Thorsen himself. In Norway's second largest city of Bergen, which happens to be my hometown, and this was certainly the most disturbing incident to have happened over the past year in Norway. A SIAN demonstration in September this year led to some 30 youth of migrant background breaking police cordons and assaulting Lars Thorsen of SIAN. He was actually pelted with stones, and police had to evacuate him and his domestic partner, Anna Bråten, and Thorsen was then, as a result of stone throwing, bleeding heavily from a head wound. And local police in Bergen engaged in quite disproportionate use of tear gas against legal minors of minority background. Now, I'm not talking here about the use of tear gas against the sort of the counter demonstrations who attacked Thorsen. I'm here referring to quite significant evidence of local police in Bergen using tear gas in situations in which they were confronted with, you know, one or two teenage girls of minority background far from the venue of the demonstration in the hours that followed. So what is the legal context here? I have to say something about the Norwegian laws on blasphemy, hate speech, and free speech. I mean, part of what is of interest here is, of course, that across the world we have quite different conceptions about free speech and the limits of free speech. And when this presents such an interesting case, it is because in today's globalized world, we cannot assume that the standards of free speech in one particular context, such as the Norwegian, would be understood in other parts of the world. I mean, following the desecration of the Quran in Kristiansand in November last year, there were resolutions in the Pakistani parliament calling upon Norwegian authorities to punish the blasphemers, right? So senators in the Pakistani Senate obviously were not aware of the fact that there's no such thing as blasphemy provisions under current Norwegian laws. The Norwegian ambassador to Pakistan was called to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Islamabad and given an official note of protest of what had happened. There were also official reactions from authorities in Turkey, and these were, you know, often based on the assumption that, given that countries such as Turkey and Pakistan have blasphemy provisions in their laws, this should also apply in the Norwegian context, which it doesn't, right? So I have to say something about this. Norwegian blasphemy laws, the then Norwegian General Penal Code 142, paragraph 142, was first introduced in 1902. The first predecessor was, in fact, the Danish-Norwegian King Kristiansand IV's Norwegian law from 1687. But Norwegian General Penal Code, paragraph 142, was abolished by an act of parliament in May 2015. It had, in fact, never been much in use, having last led to criminal prosecution in 1933. In other words, now we're looking at almost 90 years ago. This was the case against the famous Norwegian poet and anti-Nazi author Arnold Øverland, who was charged with blasphemy for having referred in a speech to the Norwegian University of Oslo Students Association in 1933 as the seventh plague of Christianity as the seventh plague of the nation. In fact, the original criminal complaint in that case was made by the then rector of the MF School of Theology, which hosts the INTERSECT project, Ole Hallesby, who was known as a very conservative Norwegian theologian, right? But Øverland was acquitted. So the last person to be convicted of blasphemy in Norway was, in fact, a social democratic newspaper editor named Arnfred Olsen, way back in 1912. And though the ambit of the law included religious minorities in Norway, for all practical purposes, laws against blasphemy in Norway have historically protected majoritarian Christianity, right? So there's no record of cases in which anyone have successfully gotten Norwegian courts to accept a case on the basis of blasphemy against anyone that is not a Christian. Something called the Islamic Defense Association tried to do that with the publishing editors of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses back in 1988, I think it was, but the public prosecutor was quite clear about the fact that he wouldn't prosecute on those grounds. Norwegian laws against hate speech were first introduced after the so-called swastika pandemic, a series of anti-Semitic incidents which originated in far-right milieux in former West Germany in 1959 to 1960, and which also spread globally, also to Norway. Norwegian General Penal Code, paragraph 135A, was introduced in 1970 as a result of Norway's ratification of the 1965 UN International Convention against all forms of racist discrimination, in other words, UN ICERD. Now, this law was the first law which led to a successful hate speech prosecution. That happened in 1977 when a school teacher, a neo-Nazi school teacher in Vesterålen in northern Norway, was convicted for anti-Semitic speech. The teacher in question was named Olaf Hors. When that case is of relevance to this case that I'm presenting on now, it is because he was convicted on the grounds of having called for the forced deportation of Jews from Norway. Quite similarly to SIAN currently calling openly for the forced deportation of named Norwegian Muslims from Norway. So Norwegian police law, dating from 1995, in paragraph 11, officially permits Norwegian police authorities to prohibit public events such as demonstrations due to so-called reasonable fears of serious disturbances of public order or violations of laws. This is my personal translation, so you have to take my word for it. And it's also a fact that the European Human Rights Convention, Article 10, as incorporated in Norwegian law through the so-called Human Rights Act, number 30 of 1999, permits restricting freedom of expression due to public safety concerns. So why aren't Norwegian police officers intervening when SIAN tries to burn the Quran or make public hate speech? I will come to that in the next slide, but there is one important Supreme Court verdict that I have to mention, which is of high relevance to this case, namely the Supreme Court verdict against Evie Krogh in 1981. This was a precedent-setting verdict in the Norwegian case. It established the legal principle that paragraph 135A, which is now paragraph 185 in Norwegian General Penal Code, was not designed to protect religious faiths, but individuals, right? So as long as you stay clear of targeting Muslims as individuals in your racist hate speech in Norway and concentrate on Islam as such, there's no risk of you being prosecuted. But we also have to look at other laws in Norway in order to understand how the Norwegian police engaged with this. The Norwegian Constitution's paragraph 100 on freedom of expression was last revised by Act of Parliament in Norway in October 2000. Here I'm wrong. It should say 2014. It's not 2004. The new formulation, which dates from 2004, has it in section 3 that censorship and other preventative measures cannot be used except in cases involving children and youth that need to be protected against damaging impacts from live pictures. And here the legislators obviously have violence and child pornography in mind. So what is the reason why the police doesn't intervene? It's a fact that chief police lawyers in Norway have, in the context of the demonstrations of SIAN, made it clear that they currently interpret the Norwegian Constitution's paragraph 100 as an absolute prohibition of police restricting SIAN demonstrations, even in the event of likely threats to public order and safety, and likely criminal hate speech during these demos. I also need to say a few words about SIAN. So this was officially established in 2008, but it had an organizational precursor, and this organizational precursor and the organizational genealogy, as it were, of SIAN was outlined by the then chairman of SIAN, Mr. Arne Thumør, in a speech he made to the annual meeting of SIAN back in 2013, which is publicly available. And there, Thumør points to the origins as having been FOMI, or Forum mot Islamisering, which was established in Oslo in 2000. And here we get into the details of SIAN's background in far-right milieux, because some Norwegians tend to think that this is something new in SIAN. It is certainly not the case. Among the founder members of FOMI, there was one Arne Borgir, a former Norwegian neo-Nazi volunteer for Germans' Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front during World War II. And the Waffen-SS Division Viking, which was operative on the killing fields of the Ukraine in the winter of 1942 and 1943. We know perfectly well from the historical record that they must have been part of the indiscriminate slaughter of Jewish civilians, children, women, and men in what was, according to historians such as Timothy Snyder, a trial run for the Holocaust. Borgir remained a committed Nazi and Holocaust denialist until his death in 2006. There was also Mr. Erik Jens Onsdag, Norwegian Supreme Court attorney and decorated resistance veteran from World War II, who later became a founder member of the precursor to the Norwegian Progress Party, the Anders Langes Party, in 1973. He was a lifelong supporter of the racist apartheid regime in South Africa and self-admitted Norwegian spy for Ian Smith's racist regime in Rhodesia. Jens Onsdag was also founder member of the violent racist popular movement against immigration, or FMI, Folkebevegelsen mot innvandring, in Norway in 1987. There was also Mr. Jarle Synnevåg, a former researcher at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, FFE, in Norway, who was, after Al-Qaeda's terrorist attacks on the US on September 11, 2001, sentenced for violations of Norwegian hate speech codes for sending out an estimated 10,000 racist emails, and he was subsequently also fired from his post at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. And Synnevåg is widely believed to have continued his online activities in counter-jihadist circles. The last trace of we have of him is writings stating to Anders Behring Breivik's terrorist attacks in 2011 in Norway. So here's Arne Thumør, SIAN founder and chair, 2008 to 15. Now he was, just to say very few things about Thumør, He was for many years an active member of the Norwegian Labour Party, a newspaper editor, and actually one of the founder members of the Norwegian Humanist Association's branch in Bergen, my hometown, who in the late 1990s increasingly started to take a far-right turn. And he was in fact fired as a regional leader for the Norwegian Humanist Association in 1998 because he had started expressing publicly his sympathies for far-right and racist ideas. So what more do we know about SIAN at present? SIAN members are overwhelmingly white and male and over the age of 60. But they are not necessarily socially marginal. A recent survey of some 184 SIAN members, and there's a fresh Master of Arts degree in political science from the University of Oslo by one student named Hans Petter Tranøy, entitled Aktivister mot Islam, an empirisk studie av medlemmene i SIAN, which includes this survey. And he found, and we have to underline here that this is a strategic sample, right? The 184 SIAN members that Tranøy managed to get responses from in his survey are not representative of the total number of SIAN members. But this survey, interestingly enough, found that they had above average levels of education and income and were more likely to be married than not. So there goes the idea that, as long as certain white males get married and have children, you save them from having far-right views. Now, of these 184 SIAN members surveyed, 39% said that they voted for the Progress Party, whereas a further 34 said that they voted for parties even further to the right of the Progress Party, such as Democratene. In the Bible Belt city of Kristiansand, which I know something about, there have been close political contacts and exchange of personnel between SIAN and Formi leaders and Democratene dating back to the early 2000s. Democratene obtained 15% of the votes in Kristiansand in the last municipal elections and 30% in the suburb of Kjevik in Kristiansand. And Kjevik is where the airport in Kristiansand is located. So not that marginal in terms of local impact and influence. A Norwegian state broadcaster NRK investigation in 2018 found that no less than 20 municipal election candidates for the governing Progress Party had been active in SIAN's open Facebook groups in the period 2013 to 18. Though the Progress Party claims to be opposed to racism and to exclude members on the grounds of racist speech, no action from the central leadership of the Progress Party appears to be taken against any of these 20 Progress Party SIAN sympathizers. This is the current chair of SIAN, Mr. Lars Thorsen, who was democratically elected as the new chairperson in early 2019. He was originally a Conservative Party youth activist from Kolbotn outside Oslo and has worked in accounting, but is currently unemployed and lives off social welfare grants. He has no higher degrees and is an autodidact on Islam and Muslims. I've seen Thorsen in hate speech courts in a hate crimes trial, the first trial in which he was charged and convicted of hate speech. And he presented himself, interestingly enough, to the court as some kind of expert on Islam, right? So he interrupted the magistrate, a young female magistrate, on several occasions, making or asking her and the court the question, I don't know what you really know about Islam. In other words, implying that he knew something that the court didn't know about Islam. and also in his demeanor. He had brought several books of tafsir and copies of the Quran into the courtroom, which he had strategically placed close to his sort of witness box in the courtroom, in order to create the impression that, you know, I know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Islam and Muslims. His long-standing domestic partner, Mrs. Anna van Broughton, has for the same period been a vice chair of SIAN and is also a social welfare recipient. Now, this may come across as me taking some kind of, you know, middle-class arrogant attitudes towards poor working-class Norwegians. But when I mention it, it is, of course, because one of the central tenets of their own speeches has for quite a long time been that Norwegian Muslims are welfare scroungers, or trygdesnyltere, in their public speeches, right? So they make, even though they themselves live on social welfare, they lambast Norwegian Muslims for living off Norwegian social welfare benefits, right? Under their leadership, both SIAN's discourse about Islam and Muslims and their demonstrations have been radicalized. Thorsen was first committed for criminal violations of Norwegian hate speech law by Oslo Magistrates Court on November 8, 2019. The charges related to a series of brochures and a speech in Stovner in Oslo East in February 2018, in which Thorsen had referred to Muslim men as sexual predators and Muslims as murder zombies. His co-defendant, SIAN co-chair Anna van Broughton, was in fact acquitted for the same charges. The verdict was confirmed upon appeal by the Borgarting Court of Appeals in January 2020. There's a lot to be said about this court verdict. I think it as far as Norwegian hate speech jurisprudence is concerned, in making the rather startling claim that Thorsen had offended Islam, which, if we go back to this Divi Krog verdict, is very problematic, because Norwegian law, under Norwegian law and Norwegian jurisprudence since 1981, there is no such thing as a criminal sanction for offending Islam, right? It is Muslims that we're talking about. It's also problematic in that Broughton gets acquitted for making the very same dehumanizing remarks about Muslims as her male partner, Thorsen, is convicted for, right? So there's a paradox here in that it appears that Broughton escapes criminal conviction on the very simple ground that she happens to be a female, right, rather than a male. Okay, I need to round off. But SIAN demonstrations have now increasingly involved well-known Norwegian neo-Nazis with clear links to the Nordic resistance movement and boot boys. We've seen these activists in quite a number of recent SIAN demonstrations. And they have, since this critical event in Kristiansand in November last year, received extensive media coverage by engaging in desecration of the Quran, which includes, in this case, Qur'an-burning, spitting on the Quran, and tearing out pages from the Quran in sort of contempt of the Quran. And this is a kind of free speech provocation ritual, which is heavily inspired by a Danish far-right activist who we know have, over the past few years, been in extensive contact with SIAN, Mr. Rasmus Paludan, and his far-right fringe party, Hardline, or Stram Kurs in Denmark, who also travels around Denmark and burns the Quran under heavy police protection, and in areas of cities in Denmark, which has a heavy immigrant population. SIAN rhetoric has, under Thorsen and Bråten, increasingly also involved open calls for ethnic cleansing of Norwegian Muslims by means of deportation and internment. Bråten has also recently eulogized the Norwegian right-wing extremist terrorists from July 22nd, 2011, namely Anders Behring Breivik. So I have followed this, starting with my role as an expert witness for the defense in a civil defamation lawsuit, which was brought by the then SIAN chair against a local imam in Kristiansand, Mr. Akmal Ali, in February 2015. Akmal Ali had been brought to court by Tumur and SIAN for having referred to SIAN as a racist organization in an interview with a public broadcast in 2013. In September 2019, I attended Thorsen and Bråten's hate crimes trial in Oslo Magistrate Court. In January 2020, I was invited by the Muslim Council Agder to a 5 hours public debate at Arkivet Memorial Site and Museum in Kristiansand with Muslim leaders and civil society activists from the entire Agder region, municipal managers and politicians, leaders of local interreligious dialogue organizations, as well as senior police officers from Kristiansand. In September 2020, a public debate at Arkivet with the head of police in Kristiansand, as well as local politicians. And I have, since January 2020, had regular contacts and dialogue with local Muslim youth, local Muslim leaders, municipal officers, and politicians in the city of Kristiansand. Some findings from my research, and this is where I'll try to end off. SIAN increasingly invokes absolutist conceptions of free speech in their rhetoric. Interestingly enough, this is of course a one-sided game in which they at the same time call for the banning of the Quran, demolishing mosques or prohibiting the construction of future mosques, and call for the ethnic cleansing of Muslims from Norway. Now, when you use your own free speech to advance messages such as this, it basically shows that your commitment to free speech is very one-sided indeed, right? It's even contradictory. SIAN appeals to free speech must above all be seen as a strategical move in that it avails them with a language and a set of commitments that are attractive also to liberal centrists in Norway and elsewhere, and not the least in Norwegian media. SIAN appeals to free speech also create and sustain polarization. Free speech is posited as something one is either for or against, and counter demonstrations, whether Muslims or anti-racists, are posited as against free speech. I should also mention that I mentioned this transnational dimension here with messages coming from Pakistani Senate, the Pakistani government, and the Turkish government. But it bears mentioning that local Muslim leaders in Kristiansand have in fact spent considerable time and energy on trying to limit fallout from this, the local and national fallout, through contact with media in Pakistan and Turkey, right? Because in Pakistan and Turkey, media presented an image of, Muslims in Kristiansand and in Norway in general as being absolutely beleaguered, right? And in some sense, that isn't an unfair assumption to make, but these Muslim leaders also had to argue that, Norway is a democracy, and in fact, we are able to have our rights respected by Norwegian authorities, both municipal authorities and national authorities. They have been advised on this by UK-based Muslim civil society actors. And as I mentioned, understandings of Norwegian law does not necessarily travel well to Muslim countries with blasphemy provisions, right? So it's hard to understand if you're based in Pakistan or Turkey, that this can even happen in Norway, right? In the local Muslim community in Kristiansand, SIAN's public Qur'an-burning generated divisions between different generations of Muslims and or local Muslims with highly variegated experience with Norwegian society and lengths of time as residents of Norway. The established mosque and Muslim leadership in Kristiansand have long been heavily invested in interreligious dialogue and cordial relationships with local authorities, including the municipality and police. But this is, of course, a bit of a catch-22, because this also means that both among younger Muslims and some Muslims who have only been in Norway for a few years would like to see the local established mosque leadership and Muslim leaders to take a more confrontational and direct stance on behalf of their Muslim constituents, have increasingly distanced themselves from the local Muslim leadership, and or in cases also been actively marginalized by the very same leadership, right? So, local police appear to have significant challenges relating to police relations with local minority youth. This is also openly admitted by some police sources, but at the same time, local police chiefs have targeted local media reporters who have tried to cover issues relating to structural or systemic racism in local media. As far as prosecution goes, right, and I want to end off by saying this publicly. In the speech that Lars Thorsen of SIAN made before setting fire to the Quran in Kristiansand on November 16, 2019, he referred to Muslims in the very same term that he had only 8 days previously, on November 8, 2019, been convicted by Oslo Magistrate Court for making. In other words, he referred to Muslims as murder zombies and Muslim males as sexual predators. And there's been 2 criminal complaints filed against him for hate speech under Norwegian General Penal Code, paragraph 185, as a result of his use of that particular terminology. First was filed by lawyers acting on behalf of the Muslim Council of Agder in November 2019. Second was filed by the Norwegian Center Against Racism in March 2020. But so far, there's been no prosecutorial decision on this case in Kristiansand, and it's been 9 months. And to me, it looks like this is quite a simple matter. This is a case that was originally filed as no criminal case by the chief public prosecutor at the police headquarters in Kristiansand. It was returned to him by the public prosecutor in the Agder region, who had even consulted the prosecutor general in Oslo. It was returned to Kristiansand police headquarters with a clear instruction that this case is to be properly investigated. 9 months on from all of this, there's no news about whether or not Thorsen and SIAN will be prosecuted for this, and there's no date set for any criminal trial. The question this raises is, of course, whether Norwegian hate speech laws apply universally and equally in Kristiansand as they do in Oslo, or should be subject to local prosecuting whims. Now, a safe way to undermine respect for law is to treat laws as a kind of patchwork that you can apply unequally, right? And if that were to happen in the coming months, my prediction is that, you know, in Kristiansand, one would be in grave difficulties between the police and local Muslim minorities. Thank you very much. I've gone way over time, so apologies to Iselin and Mumita.
Thanks a lot, Sindre. I think it was quite acceptable that you went over time, simply because this is so interesting, and it's yeah, the material is deeply problematic, as you very well show us. And I also would like to thank you, Sindre, for your long-term work on this free speech, hate speech conundrum, and for highlighting these dilemmas of an absolutist free speech stand. And to me, it's quite of a big question why there is not more legal debate among lawyers as well about these issues. I had a small, that was my comment, and then I just had a small question that I would like you to engage with. And in the meantime, we will really welcome people to post their questions in the Q&A session. So to me, it's really fascinating how you describe these burning of the Quran as a public theatrical ritual. And I would invite you to share your reflections on what does that make or how does that contribute to a particularly conflictual statement in a way.
Mm.
And how this travels apparently between the Nordic countries as a traveling practice, as it were, of a ritual offending of religion in public spaces in the Nordic region, which we know is dominated by these very secularist understandings. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, part of my interest in all of this, of course, stems from the fact that it kind of very visibly demonstrates numerous issues relating to what you've correctly identified as the hate speech, free speech conundrum that we're faced with here. And I think, you know, we absolutely also have to see this in the context of, for want of a better word, Norwegian secularist traditions, which and in which, and this comes from Talal Asad, right? He quite controversially, I think, and I should note at the outset here that one of my early contributions was a systematic critique of Talal Asad's take on secularism, which was published in a journal called Anthropological Theory in 2009. But Assad referred to in one of his articles about the cartoon crisis, I think it was published back in 2006, as trying to understand French secularism, that free speech in the current European secular context, and we also have to bear in mind here that Norway is not France, right? It has historically been in a kind of intermediate position when it comes to secularism between the very absolutist French conceptions and a sort of Anglo-Saxon tradition. But he referred therein to free speech as a new sacred secular dogma, right? And it is really troubling because one notes in a lot of public debates in the Nordic countries in the past 15 years, and starting, I think, for real with the Danish cartoon crisis of 2005 and 2006, an assumption that once you've said free speech, then the matter is settled. In other words, if you try to raise questions pertaining to what particular uses of what Titley refers to as, or the capture of free speech, what that does to our societies that are, to all extent and purposes, increasingly multicultural and multi-religious, then you're on the wrong side all of a sudden. Right? And there's a lot to be said about, you know, this as a traveling practice, I mean, the radical extreme here is presented by Rasmus Paludan, and I don't think I mentioned that SIAN has tried on a number of occasions to invite him to Norway to take part in the demonstrations. Now, Paludan has, you know, it's a matter of public record that Paludan has mental problems, right? And he's been convicted of hate speech. He was even charged with blasphemy under Danish law for setting fire to the Quran back in 2017. To date, Danish police have spent some 100 million Danish kroner in protecting him against counter-protesters across Denmark, right? And he does more radical things than SIAN does, right? So not only does he set fire to the Quran, he also urinates on the Quran before doing so, or wraps the Quran in bacon, right? And to most of us, you know, this is, you know, it's uncivil behavior, right? And it's senseless. You know, what purpose does it serve, right? But we also need to understand it in terms of the changing conceptions of free speech, I think, and the entire free and hate speech conundrum in the Nordic countries, where I think we have, to an increasing extent, moved towards, you know, U.S. First Amendment understandings, right? Which are much more, you know, absolutist in the conception of free speech and its limits than what has historically been the case in the Nordic countries. And the paradox in all of this is, of course, that a lot of the same people who are in liberal media, who are constantly warning about the importation of U.S. cultural wars to Norway, right? For all practical purposes, this is, you know, a transnational import, right? This new absolutist conception. Mm.
Thank you so much. There is a question here from Stig, and I would like to read it out.
Yep.
You talked more or less like a lawyer, summarizing legal positions. What is the anthropological or historical angle that you would like to pursue?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Stig, for that question. I have to say that this is very much work in progress, right?